This is Rogers TV.
Focused on quality and convenience, there isn't much you won't find at Marie's Mini Mart. Home-style breads, sandwiches, plus a variety of artisan breads and delicious single-serve desserts available exclusively at our Frecker Drive location. Marie's Mini Mart, with 25 locations wherever you go, there we are.
We're happy to welcome our guest back today for part 2 of our interview. He is the 5th Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador and a former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Newfoundland and Labrador. I'm happy to welcome Clyde Wells to the program. Nice to have you again.
Good to be back. Thank you, Karl.
I'd like now to move ahead. We finished off the last half hour we did talking about your leaving the Smallwood government. I'd like to begin now with you being approached, I believe it was in 1987, by the Liberal Party of Newfoundland and Labrador to become the leader, which you did, of course. Why did you feel the need to take that on at that time?
Well, I'm not sure I felt the need to take it on as much as it was an appropriate time for me to get back. I didn't have the concerns that I had in 1968 and 1971 when I resigned from the House. My family was growing. My youngest child then was 17, I think, or 16. And the concerns, and we had moved to St. John's because the legal work that I was doing in the interim took me into St. John's. So I could more readily get involved without having as great an adverse impact on my family. And it was a difficult time for the Liberal Party. Mr. Barry had been the Liberal leader, and the caucus had kicked over the traces and asked to have a leadership convention called very shortly, I think within a year or two of his becoming leader. So it left him in a very difficult position. And when they came to me, I thought about it, talked to my wife about it, and we agreed I'd give it another go.
Mm-hmm. So you won the election, won a majority. You're now in the cabinet room, sitting in the very same seat that Joey Smallwood sat in, I presume. What was going through your mind when you realized that now you had this heavy responsibility? And at the time, I think we were not in great shape because it seemed like the Tories at that time were a spent force. They were, flailing around, coming up with ideas to try to gee up the economy. The last gasp was the cucumber factory. And now here you are inheriting this.
There were a number of major concerns that got me back to deal with, one of which was the financial situation. We'd been having consistent deficits and building up the provincial debt year after year. Now, we weren't any different than most other jurisdictions in Canada. They were, including the federal government, had been doing the same thing, but that needed to be dealt with. And as Mr. Peckford said, if we don't deal with it, it'll be 1934 all over again when we had Commission of Government. So that was one big factor. Another big factor at the time was Meech Lake had just been proclaimed. And I disagreed very strongly with that because it was creating classes of provinces in Canada, and that, in my view, was totally unacceptable. So that was a big concern. The other big concern was that we hadn't been building an economic base, and we seemed to be concentrating activity in St. John's, and the population from around the province was moving into St. John's, and every new economic activity was being in the St. John's area. So we were headed for a situation where if we didn't deal with this effectively, pretty soon the St. John's, the capital area, would be doing fine, but it would be capital of nothing else. There'd be virtually nothing else except dependencies around the province. So I felt that needed to be addressed. And I also felt the education situation needed to be addressed as well. Those things got me back in it as well, and I realized we had to deal with those. And as it so happened, the first thing that really came to the fore was the Meech Lake Accord, and that was a big factor.
Well, since you mention it, and I mean, you know, we could spend an hour talking about Meech Lake alone, but since you've mentioned it, I wanted to ask you this. Towards the end, I think, of 1990, Prime Minister Mulroney gave an interview to the Globe and Mail, and he was essentially saying that he had purposely drawn the process out to the very end so that he could pressurize people like you and Gary Filmon and others into basically accepting the accord as it was, no changes. He called it rolling the dice.
It was a roll of the dice.
The roll of the dice.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, what were you thinking when you read that interview?
Well, I'm not sure what motivated Mr. Mulroney to do that, because, I mean, if he thought this was a clever thing, a clever trick to overcome people by some sort of unprincipled basis, that's not a very commendable approach. It has nothing to do with the merit of the issue or anything else. It's an abusive technique, achieving your objective, even though the objective may have no merit whatsoever. You positively achieve it by doing something that's underhanded or untoward. And that's the way it came off, and that's the way it sounded to people. And Mr. Mulroney's boast was essentially just that. And so it was, most people were horrified by it, in fact.
Yeah. Well, I remember the way I took it was that this process was a sham from the beginning, that Quebec and the federal government was never intended to change its mind, that, you know, they were sticking with the accord as it was, come hell or high water. That's how I interpreted it anyway at the time.
Well, of course, they were making that clear all along. Premier Bourassa said, there can't be any changes. It's absolute, no changes whatsoever. And I mean, you can't have a country run that way where one province is decisive of how the Constitution will unfold and will be amended or adjusted solely to benefit the interests of that province. That's no way to run a federation.
Yeah. Now, moving on to a couple of other accomplishments of your administration. Well, I want to talk about two things. I want to talk about amalgamation, municipal amalgamation, and education reform. The school system, you wanted to turn it into a secular system and streamline it. You started the process, but unfortunately you didn't accomplish it in your administration. I think the following administration did manage to get it done. Well,
it was done in two stages, and Premier Tobin often said, if the first stage hadn't occurred, you couldn't achieve the second stage directly. So what we were doing, I wasn't opposed to denominational education as such. I didn't think it was any evil or wrong about it. But what was wrong about it is causing a situation in smaller communities around the province with maybe 100 students and 3 or 4 separate schools. I mean, that was just madness. We couldn't possibly afford that situation. To have denominational schools in St. John's or Corner Brook or Grand Falls or larger centers where you could justify it and still not adversely impact the quality of education in the other schools in the area, okay, I didn't quarrel with that. So that was the concession that we made to the churches that wanted to maintain it. Okay, where it's justified, that can be done. But particularly the Roman Catholic representatives and the Pentecostal representatives bitterly opposed even that. They just wanted it to be absolute, and they set about thwarting the workings of that system. And when a judge set aside a decision on the basis of their opposition to it, then by then Premier Tobin was in office, and he said, that's it, we finish it off. And he sought another amendment that eliminated church involvement altogether. And I would say both those churches are now saying, I wish we had stayed with what Clyde Wells had proposed, because now they don't get any funding for, they say, St. Bon's as a separate school.
Oh, totally, yeah.
It's totally privately financed. But under the system that we had in a place like St. John's, where it could be justified, there would also be public funding available.
Yeah. It's amazing to me that it took so long for this to happen, because I believe this was an issue that was brought up as far back as Bond and Whiteway. It
was certainly brought up when I was in Mr. Smallwood's
yes,
at the time.
Yeah.
I remember seeing speeches after that I gave in the House of Assembly addressing just that question.
But 100 years ago, I believe, again, it was the Roman Catholic Church.
Yeah.
Because they had a tremendous amount of power, didn't they?
They really did,
Yeah.
and they thwarted that kind of development.
Yeah.
People don't realize the challenge it is for government, and amalgamation is another answer. We had, when I became Premier, I think something 450 separate municipalities. Now, we only had a total population of 550 or 60,000 at the time. And those all distributed around the province, and all these separate municipalities, and in areas, and even including St. John's and Mount Pearl. I think having St. John's and Mount Pearl separately is a form of madness. It's unnecessary, and it creates an unfairness, and that's one of my regrets, not pursuing more vigorously the amalgamation of Mount Pearl. But there were a variety of other places where we were able to effect amalgamation, and it worked quite well. Grand Falls and Windsor is a logical one. I mean, right across the street, you drive out Topsail Road now. One side of it is Mount Pearl, the other side is the city of St. John's.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's a bit crazy.
It's a bit crazy,
Yeah.
and incredibly expensive, and should never be allowed to continue.
When you took over, the fishery was already in decline. But did you have any idea that a couple of years later, we were going to receive this gut punch from the federal government, where they said, no more cod fishing? We're imposing a moratorium.
Not first when I took over, but probably within a number of months of taking over, I got an indication that that could possibly happen. And that came from Dr. Harris. Remember Dr. Leslie Harris?
Yes.
He had been the commissioner appointed to assess the issue, and he did a great job of it. He sat down with me one day and explained it in detail, and why the fishery was going to collapse. And he made it very clear. He said, suppose this black carpet that we're on was the fish stock,
right?
The Atlantic cod fish stock, which was a huge fish stock at one time. And that little container of water, this little glass, is the fishing vessel. So long as it's anywhere within that, it'll be able to catch a full catch. But the fishermen, inshore fishermen, were complaining, remember?
Yes.
You can't catch the same fish twice, they used to say. And the trawler companies would say, there's no problem, there's all kinds of fish. But as Dr. Harris explained, so long as your little fishing boat is in the center of the mass, you'll get lots of fish. Now, when that fishing boat gets reduced to the size of the table, you will still get it, but it'll be a little more difficult to get it. And when it gets reduced to the size of the base of that lamp, it's too late.
Yeah.
They're gone. There's none left. And that's what happened.
Yeah.
And that, I've never forgotten his explanation. It was clear, and for the first time, I realized what a threat there was to the fishery. And I realized that when Mr. Crosby, as federal fisheries minister, closed the fisheries, he had no real alternative. It was either he was going to close it and try and salvage what was left, or it was all going to be gone and nothing would be left, which didn't make any sense.
Now, did you have any input at all in terms of how the compensation to the displaced fishermen would be handled, or was that strictly a federal government responsibility?
It was a federal government responsibility, and they did take responsibility, having closed it, primarily on the basis that they had moral responsibility for allowing this fishing circumstance to develop.
Because they had control.
They had control. They were the ones who were policing it. And for the first 5 years after Confederation in '49, Newfoundland fishery laws still apply. But then they were canceled and the federal laws took over completely. They were in control, and it was on their watch. And one of the first things that I had to deal with was the federal government giving France a right to catch codfish in the Newfoundland area. And that was a big controversy at the time. And I objected most strenuously to it, but they were in control, and they allowed it to go ahead. So in the end, they recognized their moral responsibility for what had happened and their responsibility to find a means of compensating fishermen or supporting them having destroyed their means of income.
I want to talk about budgets. You had the first balanced budget in the history of Newfoundland and Labrador, I believe.
No.
Am I wrong about that?
Before, in earlier years, there had been some balanced budget in Bond's time.
In Bond's time.
But I think what can be said, maybe there was a balance on the operating side, but not on the capital side, somewhere along the way. But what can be said is the last year we were in office, our last fiscal year, was the first year since Confederation when we did not increase the public debt of Newfoundland. It didn't increase. And that was the first time we had achieved that. Now, it took 7 years.
I don't think that's been achieved since, has it?
I don't know. There were years when we had major income from oil revenue, where that may have occurred, I would think. But at that time, while the oil industry was getting started, there was no revenue from it prior to 1998. Right. So while we were trying to build it and put it in place, that was the first year that, since Confederation in '49, when we didn't increase the province's public debt. I consider that to be a mark of success, because we had to eliminate the persistent deficit, and you couldn't do it in one fell swoop. Technically, you could do it, but you couldn't live with the impact of it. So you had to get it built over a period of time, and you had to ultimately persuade people that it was the right thing to do, to cut back on hospital services, on highway services, on all other public services, in order to start to live within our means. And for the first year or so, that was very difficult, and we got a tremendous amount of criticism. But after a year and a half, I started to hear comments in the public generally. You can't expect government to do everything. We got to understand, we've got to live within our means. We got to have these cutbacks. And that was encouraging, so we persisted with it. But some groups in the province took a very strong opposition to what we were doing. In particular, the teachers were really upset with us, and they had the preferential position. They were getting the highest kind of pension level of entitlement. I think it worked out to a value of about 16%. And weren't paying 3% to achieve it. And not only that, they had achieved this 30 and out idea, that teachers were burned out after 30 years and they could retire. And to complicate it still further, they could count their 4 years of their university education as unpaid credit toward their pension time. And I mean, there's no way we could withstand that. So we determined we were going to eliminate it. We couldn't negotiate adjustment with the teachers, and in the end, the only way we could achieve it was to go to an election on that issue, which we did in 1993. And fortunately, the people of the province saw where we were going. They approved the approach that the government was taking, and in fact, they increased our majority in the House. So that gave us the strength to continue on.
Yeah. There are those who argue that as far as that a household budget and a government budget are two different things, and that there is a case to be made for sometimes having a government budget that isn't balanced because of unforeseen circumstances, you know, the need to stimulate the economy, that sort of thing. Where do you sit on that?
Oh, and that's absolutely right. In the case of government, there's nothing wrong with deficit financing in those years when there's a reason for it. But you can't do that on a consistent basis. You can't live beyond your means. Governments have to generate enough revenue to pay the bills they incur. And if they're going to just keep incurring bills and never pay them off, then the debt is going to pile up, and ultimately, like Argentina and other places, you don't go bankrupt, because governments don't go bankrupt, but you default on your international obligations. And you don't want to see the province in that position. So I felt that we had a responsibility to deal with it by, over a reasonable period of time, reducing the deficit. And we achieved that by 1996 when I retired. And then with the prospect of increasing oil revenues, we could bring the debt down. I had also hoped to make a major contribution toward reduction of the debt by privatizing Newfoundland and Labrador Hydro, and the capital we would have gotten back from that could have been used to greatly reduce the debt, and as well, it would then have left it to the private sector to invest the capital in building electrical facilities and transmission facilities and so on, which is a proper private sector thing, particularly where it could be regulated by a public utilities board, and you could assure proper and fair treatment of the public by the regulatory power of the Public Utilities Board. So that's what was prompting the proposal to sell hydro.
There was a great wave of resistance to that idea at the time. Some people, I think, said that you hadn't done enough public consultation, that sort of thing. If you had to do it over again, would you take a different approach?
I might well have done it. I might have been far better for us had we had a greater level of public consultation on the issue. Taking it on, and we tried to explain why we were doing it, but those who were opposed to it made an emotional issue out of it. You're selling our birthright. Well, look where our birthright has got us today. If Newfoundland Labrador Hydro had been privatized in 1996 or 1995, when we were endeavoring to do it, we wouldn't be in the financial mess we're in today. Our debt would have been reduced by the amount of the proceeds we achieved from the sale of it. The private sector would have taken over, and whatever merit was in developing Muskrat Falls or Gull Island would have been assessed on a private basis, and they would have put the money into it, not the public of Newfoundland. And we would not have that debt today. And I regret today that we weren't able to achieve that in the face of the emotional arguments at the time, which had no real foundation. But these kinds of emotional arguments about selling your birthright and you're abandoning Newfoundland. And as well, it probably was a little more difficult for me to make the case for the sale of it, particularly to the largest hydroelectric private hydroelectric facility in the province, Newfoundland Light and Power, because shortly before becoming Premier, I had been chairman of the board of directors of Newfoundland Light and Power. So it was easy to falsely make a taint. Before I ever ran, as soon as I acquired the leadership of the Liberal Party, before I ever had a seat in the House, I had disposed of all shares and all connection with Newfoundland Light. But they were still able to use it.
Yeah. Looking back over your time as Premier of this province, do you have any other regrets, or is there anything you would have done differently? Or
well, I regret that we didn't proceed further with the development of the regional economic zones. We had it done and put in place, and they were functioning. But a subsequent government, I think it was Mr. Williams, killed it all. You see, one of the economic problems with Newfoundland is we're not going to have very much in this province if we have a very prosperous, active job-generating area around St. John's and Conception Bay South, and nothing anywhere else. And that's where we're headed. And one of the things that's different about Newfoundland is we never developed a county system of administration. Like all other jurisdictions in North America, like copied from Europe, they all have the counties. Usually there were river valleys because the communication was up and down rivers at the time. So we never had that. You moved around the bays. You related to Conception Bay and you moved by boat. Well, once the high roads got in and transportation was by road, that was what we should have focused on economically, and it was necessary then for us to do that. And the plan that we had in mind was to create regional economic zones. I think there was 21 or 22 of them. I've forgotten the number now. But the idea was that you would build economic activity in 1, 2, or 3 sizable communities in each of the zones. And then if people wanted to live in the other smaller communities and drive back and forth to those communities where the economic activity was well and good, go ahead and do it. But don't expect government to build a hospital there and build schools there and provide all the public services, because we can't afford to maintain 450 municipalities with our small population. We'll concentrate on 2 or 3 large centers in each economic zone, and also the people in that economic zone would have a vehicle within which they could promote economic activity within their zone and get them more interested in it. And that was just getting underway when I decided that the time had come for me to retire, because I had promised my wife that I would be out within 10 years. And then I got into it in 1987, and this was now 1995, late, and 1996 I got out. I thought I'd have to leave time for a successor to decide whether he'd continue on with the mandate we had or take a new one. So I had to leave him some options.
Clyde, it's been a fascinating discussion, so informative, and I'm very thankful that you sat down for another 30 minutes with us.
You're most welcome. It goes very quickly.
Thank you. It does indeed. And that's it for this edition of Karl Wells Point to Point. Thank you for watching. See you next time.